South-South partnership. This is a term that the Chinese enjoy using, of course, to describe basically China-backed multilateral institutions. What I would say, and I would argue this, and I'm happy to say this to the faces of Chinese diplomats and think tankers, if you're serious about South-South cooperation, how could you claim to be a champion on that front without cooperating with the most populous country, not just in the global South, but in the world altogether, and that's India? The Deputy Secretary of State from Washington, Christopher Landau, said, and I was in a room when he said this, we of course welcome India's rise, but we're not going to make the same mistake as we did with China. And you've got to show the bully your true colors. And that is what I think India could do better in pushing back against the unreasonable extortions from the US.
Welcome Dr. Brian Wong from University of Hong Kong, and you were just back in India at the Raisina Dialogue. And I know you've written a lot about India-China relations and how Hong Kong could be kind of a liaison between the two nations. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about some of your observations that you had at the Raisina Dialogue. Like, what stood out to you?
I would say there were 3 observations I picked up whilst being in India, and especially at Raisina. And the first is there's so much tenacity and diversity as well as strategic flexibility on the part of the Indian strategic community. Why do I say that? Well, when we say a country's foreign policy can be observed by gleaning and looking at the thoughts of its leaders and also its governmental representatives and its think tanks, very often we then jump from that to the assumption that there's a degree of monotone synchronicity, right? That they basically speak in one voice and with one voice. And of course there are upsides there, which is it's unified, it's clear, the message is easy to parse, and you can sort of take from that and glean off that very quickly what the stance of a country is. When it comes to India, the sort of strategic space works differently. And as you and I both know, there's a huge variety of opinions and views and voices on issues ranging from what's going on in Gaza and the Middle East through to Sino-Indian relations, through to the United States and where the US is headed. And for a country with such an immense and gigantically, vibrant population, this is of no surprise. And yet for folks who track geopolitics closely, we may not be used to the thought that actually sometimes a government can speak with more than one voice, and that's not necessarily a sign of weakness, but strength. And so my first observation is the strength of India's foreign policy positioning stems from its ability to speak with the Iranians, where of course FS Vikram Misri signed a book of condolences commemorating and expressing his thoughts on the passing of the supreme leader. And on the other hand, PM Modi himself visited Israel, right? And I don't think that's a sign of contradiction. It's a sign instead of India's, in many ways, complex hedging, but also multi-directional alignment strategy as part of his foreign policy, so to speak. So that's the first point I want to highlight. The second observation was, being at Raisina, I was impressed by the number of young, not just speakers, but young attendees, participants, and representatives by and large who were in the audience and who were very active. I was approached by a group of young, I think, Indian university and also fresh graduates from university students who basically said to me they're working on an outfit, that is attached to an affiliate with the MEA, but it's by and large an independently run organization that aims to recruit, young foreign policy and diplomacy aspiring students from Indian universities to become, de facto student ambassadors, and also to build hopefully a pipeline eventually for these individuals to join, say, existing established think tanks, such as, of course, the ORF, which is a very prominent and important entity, not just in India, but also in the subcontinent and indeed in Asia by and large, if not beyond. And so I was struck by the youthfulness and also the vivacity of a lot of the attendees of the dialogues, because usually with most sort of diplomacy or track 1.5 conferences, all you'd get is folks who look the same gender, same ethnicity, same accent, same language, same university, same pedigree.
Somewhat the same age group.
Sharing the same views. But that was not the case at Raisina. And I really did appreciate the curation and thought that went into it by Samir, by Sanjoy, and of course the ORF team by and large. The final comment is on India as a whole. Now, I can't say I know or I familiarize myself with India as a whole by being in Delhi. And of course, we were in a bubble, right?
Yeah.
From ITC Moria through to the Taj, it was a 7-minute walk. To Cannes Market, a 10-minute drive. That was it, really. And then, yes, I got to see Qutub Minar, I got to see India Gate, but I wasn't able to see, of course, the rest of Delhi, let alone the rest of the country. And yet, even the pure, sort of very limited snapshots I got of India today enabled me to recognize that whilst inequalities remain a very serious issue and divides certainly exist, India is a country that derives its strength from the willingness of those who come from different parts of the whole to coexist alongside one another. And its weaknesses come through when this implicit social contract is broken by those who essentially eschew or repudiate multiculturalism, repudiate the tenets with which, the founding fathers of India constructed the nation. That is not to say that religious devoutness or religious devotion ought to be repudiated, and I certainly don't want to be coming across as endorsing any particular view or sort of stance on this matter, but it is to say India's pluralism is its greatest asset, and I really hope that not just Indians themselves, but also the world at large can come to cherish and benefit from such pluralism at
the
large.
way it's said, like unity in diversity, that's how
it's a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition.
But because you talk about multiple perspectives, another message that you hear in the geopolitical world a lot today is that we are moving towards a multipolar world. What do you think the role of both India and China would be in such kind of a multipolar world? And do you think we actually are moving towards a more multipolar world, or do you think there's going to be just a transition of power that we'll see?
Great question. And I'll start by noting that the professed or the much hyped about shift towards a multipolar world order is grossly exaggerated. As of 2026, as of the day when we're speaking, right, Pallavi, the US remains a dominant military and security power in the world with over 750 bases in over 80 countries and regions. Where not these bases are sources of protection or sources of liability, given recent events, that's a separate story, and recent very tragic events at that. So I don't want to come across as, trivializing the gravity of what's happening right now in West Asia. But by and large, the US remains the only portentously global military security hegemon, if you will, that's able to flex its muscles in ways that are pretty devastating for its enemies, and sometimes its allies too. Secondly, financially, the professed or the projected demise of the US dollar is again grossly exaggerated. There are no other country or even international bloc that has what the US currently has when it comes to the sort of connections of capital exporting, because that's ultimately the US's biggest export.
Do you think
the US
BRICS
dollar.
could ever do it?
No, not unless China decides to basically open up its capital account and allow for the RMB to be a freely convertible and exchangeable currency, not offshore, but onshore RMB.
And knowing China, do you
And
think
that's not going to
possible?
happen in the next 10 years, given the way the regime and, of course, its leadership views political and financial and national security. And so I don't think that's going to happen. But thirdly, and this is where it gets a bit more interesting, the US has always been able to maintain its unipolar status through the credibility of its institutions and also the brutality of its force. And what I do notice here, despite everything I've said about the persistence of the unipole, is that it is weakening. And it is weakening in two critical respects. Firstly, the US's ability to set global agenda and to partake in multilateral institutions as a leader. With Donald Trump pulling out of everything ranging from the Paris Agreement to WHO through to not committing to renewing his funding for the UN, but even also as unilateralist, dismantling to some extent of the trust that undergirded NATO's security architecture, I would say the return of Trump to power has certainly accelerated the demise of the US as the only credible agenda setter on a world stage. And secondly, when it comes to trade and supply chains, in year 2000, China's total trade volume with the world was approximately $474 billion as compared with $2 trillion on the part of the US. 24 years later, China's total trade volume with the world reached $6.2 trillion whereas the US's total trade amounted to 5.3. Still very respectable, but at some point throughout these 24 years, China overtook the US. What does that tell us? It tells us that in supply chain terms and also trade terms, At the very least, when it comes to manufacturing, China has shifted from merely being a regional powerhouse to now a globally indispensable component of most supply chains, or a majority of supply chains for important economies. For the majority of economies, China is now the largest trading partner to them, as compared in vis-a-vis the US, right, for which they've got a smaller number of total countries for which they are the largest trading partner. So supply chain dominance and also global and multilateral institution participation are of course not all there is to great power politics, and that is why I don't think the unipolar moment is over. What it does suggest, though, is at the very least is a rise of a near rival, if not a peer competitor to the US, across many important dimensions of power measurement. And additionally, beyond China and the US, the world's also getting more complicated. We heard from Mark Carty his observations about middle powers, which are really insights that, frankly, many of my friends with diplomats in ASEAN, in India, in the Gulf, have long told me, have long maintained, have long believed. Namely, in order to fend for our country's interests, it's not about not choosing sides. It's about choosing wisely and carefully and engaging with all sides.
Yeah.
So value-based realism, VBR, is a nice term, great buzzword. But I've got to say, it's nothing new in my humble opinion. It's something that many small and middle states have already been adopting in order to empower themselves, in order to give themselves cachet and also ammunition on a world stage to fend for the people's interests. So when read in this light then, what exactly is the role of the Sino-Indian relationship? And this is where I want to throw out a sort of slightly controversial concept I've just come up with literally 5 days ago. And this is the S2 concept, South-South partnership. This is a term that the Chinese enjoy using, of course, to describe basically China-backed multilateral institutions where the amorphously defined global South is empowered. What I would say, and I would argue this, and I'm happy to say this to the faces of Chinese diplomats and think tankers, if you're serious about South-South cooperation, setting aside the very valid disputes over whether or not China still counts as a part of the global South, I would say this, and given that it was never colonized, right, by the Chinese authorities' own interpretation, it was never colonized, could still be a member of the global South, but that's set that aside. In the context of South-South cooperation, how could you claim to be a champion on that front without cooperating with the most populous country, not just in the global South, but in the world altogether, and that's India. And this is why, in my humble opinion, if China and India are to break the ice and to repair the frankly deeply frayed and damaged trust, and that's a very worrying phenomenon, right, and a structural problem and malaise, well, perhaps they could start with cooperation over third-party states, joint investments, joint capacity building programs, joint knowledge and skills transfer projects, complementary supply chain arrangements in third-party countries in the global South, starting with Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries in ASEAN, which of course, as you and I both know, stand at the crossroads between China, India and the US. But then we can talk about collaboration too, vis-a-vis, say, other countries within the Indian subcontinent, minus, of course, Pakistan, given historical sensitivity. But could there not be a way on the part of the Chinese to build trust and to reassure the Indian counterparts of their intentions with regards to what they're doing right now in the IOR and also within a sort of Indian, quote-unquote, subcontinental space? Perhaps the best means of assuaging worries on the part of New Delhi is for Beijing to say, look, this is what we're doing right now with Dhaka. This is what we're doing right now in Nepal, and we are not building military bases. We are instead offering developmental assistance. Why don't you come join us? And that might be an interesting way of achieving breakthroughs and low-hanging fruits where you prove crucially that the Chinese and Indians can work together and where Chinese presence in the IOR is not to the detriment and does not undo the kind of work that India sees as integral to fending for its own neighborhood security. So that's the sort of humble suggestion I have there in terms of the S2 concept. South, India, China coming together, build a partnership, and build lots and lots of partnerships that deliver public goods that, frankly, the US, but also more generally speaking, elements of the proverbial West are increasingly shirking the responsibilities and shifting away from providing.
But where do you think the actual hesitance stems from? Of course, there's mistrust and there's historical reasons for it as well. But in current dimension, do you think it is, the presence of United States in the region and its like relationship with India, which is very different than its relationship with China. And then China, the way China perceives India or the way India perceives China has not, like historically as well, been like very direct. They don't see each other through their own perspective, but somehow through a third party perspective.
That's right.
Which brings in like a very nuanced like relationship where things go right for 2 years and then suddenly everything falls apart.
So the Deputy Secretary of State from Washington, Christopher Landau, said, and I was in a room when he said this, he basically said something, I'm paraphrasing here, right? We of course welcome India's rise, but we're not going to make the same mistake as we did with China 20 years ago, where we let China rise to become basically a competitor, taking out jobs, exporting a lot to us, and building up this asymmetrical relationship. We've learned from that. Some folks would read this as a diplomat doing his job, even though he was trained as a lawyer, actually, Chris Landau. But others, including myself, would see this as a pretty disturbing, but also reassuringly clear sign that sort of refreshingly exposed to the world what the American strategic community had probably all along thought of India as, especially since the early 2000s. It can rise, but it cannot ever be a peer competitor or rival. And so I would listen to this, right? And I'm a Hong Konger from Hong Kong, which is a part of China. But if I were an Indian national, I asked myself, how would I feel? And instead of asking myself rhetorically, I went around asking some of the folks who were at the meeting. And of course, the initial response was, oh, we understand, it's the American perspectives and so forth. But the more we talked, the more I realized, actually, many of my interlocutors were amused, were frustrated, were concerned, and were somewhat angry, if not sort of, almost indignant at the thought that the US could go around telling people, you can be this, but you cannot be that. Mm-hmm. Imagine if I told you, you can be a very good philosopher, you just can't. You can never beat me because I'm not going to let you do that. I don't know. There's something that's quite off about it if I were to then say, you're my best friend, or you're a great friend of mine. So what's the takeaway from this? My takeaway is maybe the Sino-Indian relationship and the Sino-American relationship, and indeed the Indo-American relationship, have more in common with one another than some folks would like to believe or make us believe, right? And that's because there's a tendency to say China is not a democracy, and that's a true proposition. India is a democracy, and therefore the US gets along well with India because it's a democracy. But let's not forget that many of the regimes that were overthrown by the Americans and the CIA during the Cold War were democracies in Latin America. Mm-hmm. It just happened that they were left-wing as opposed to right-wing.
And also many of its close allies today are...
Indeed. And in fact, the Iranian regime that was overthrown, or that was in part overthrown or toppled, with a democratically elected prime minister, right, Mossadegh, who was toppled by a US and also West-backed intervention that brought back the Shah in, Iran, that was also a democratically elected regime. So let's not kid ourselves into thinking that the Americans care about democracy versus autocracy in choosing partners.
Yeah,
what they really care about...
The tariff that we have on China now versus India would not be what they are.
And in fact, I would say New Delhi has been incredibly concessionary and very kind to the Americans since Trump came back. And what did you get? Or what did India get, rather? India got, allegations of unfair trade practices, extra tariffs higher than those at some point than those imposed upon China before the Supreme Court ruled that all of these tariffs were unlawful and unconstitutional. And you also had these really denigrating remarks thrown at New Delhi from the American side, right? From the
and attempts to control its foreign
Navarro
policy
and
when
Trump,
it comes to its relationship with Russia.
And additionally, that was not something that was instead asked of China, right? It's not as if Washington then said, oh, Beijing, you must cease importing Chinese oil or else no meeting between our two leaders. That didn't happen, but it happened with Delhi. Why is that? No, this is not just a rhetorical question. To me, the answer is simple. When you're faced with a bully, you must stand up and fight. You might be kind, you might be a gentle soul, you might not wish for war, you might want to be a teacher. But if the bully only understands the callous logic of might or projected might, then you've got to show the bully your true colors. And that is what I think India could do better in pushing back against the unreasonable extortions from the US. And why is it unreasonable? India had long been a capital importer as opposed to an exporter of capital. it is always, in relation to most countries, maintain by and large import-driven as opposed to an export-driven relationship in terms of its current account deficits and balance of payments. Even vis-a-vis the US, the net deficit is much smaller than that between China and the US. And yet Washington accuses India of unfair trade practices and undue protectionism and all these other allegations, which may well be based in part upon a grain of truth in that there are protectionist measures, especially in the agricultural sectors. But that's because you want to protect your own farmers' interests. That's because India has the right to protect its own citizens' interests. And yet Washington doesn't seem to comprehend that. Or if it does, its diplomats under Trump now take the sort of graceful, deferential attitudes of Delhi as something that they could be taken for granted, basically. They could take it for granted and press further, push further, and lobby for more.
But do you think...
But that, to me, is innately and normatively deeply problematic. So in short, I don't think the differences between the three countries' relationships are that stark. And if anything, I would say the following. Of course, let's not kid ourselves. Beijing, too, is worried about India's possibility in displacing it, right? But I would say that worry is, by and large, less dominant in a way Beijing currently sees the relationship, which, by the way, had been quite stable between the 1990s and all the way up to, say, the early 2010s, right? And certainly, they were on China and India, had been on positive terms during Vajpayee's tenure, during Singh's tenure, and of course, in the early years of PM Modi's tenure. The relationship was stable and positive. Maybe the two capitals kept each other at arm's length, but it wasn't as if there was active antagonism and hostility. It was not until, of course, the very unfortunate events that played out in 2020 that really systemically disrupted and undermined trust and caused, understandably from both sides, especially from the Indian side, a securitization of the relationship. And that is really something I regret and lament, from the point of view of someone who wants to see both countries work together and both peoples get to know each other better, so to speak.
But one of the things that you pointed out was that India should not let itself be bullied by the United States. One of the reasons, do you think, why it hasn't been able to take a stand or push back has been like weaknesses of its own economy and the fact that right now you see like the IT sector everybody knows is the backbone of Indian economy, but because you also research on AI, with the advent of AI that is somewhat facing heat.
So on the AI front, I would say the rise of AI presents India with a theoretical opening and possibility, and that can certainly turbocharge its telecommunications and IT industries, as long as it can maintain a value premium. So if India could double down on service exports through AI and leverage AI as an augmenting as opposed to labor substituting tool to bolster productivity of labor, then that could very well be not just a useful way of preserving economic growth, but actually expediting it. And additionally, in ensuring that employment remains available. But what I'm worried about is if the technology is used in a way that is labor substituting as opposed to augmenting, then youth unemployment, especially amongst the lower middle and the middle classes, will get worse. And that is deeply, deeply suboptimal for India from an economic perspective. And I've had these conversations with senior policymakers in Delhi during the few days whilst I was there. And there's definitely an awareness of the sort of challenges posed, but whether or not there are solutions, that remains to be seen in terms of the policy discourse. Taking a step back, I wouldn't say Delhi's been so deferential and taciturn vis-a-vis Washington because of weakness. And maybe that's because I tend to take a more, optimistic and sanguine view of diplomats' choices. I tend to read this as the product of intentional choices on a part of course, a very, very large and sprawling MEA machine, but also to some extent it's a reflection of policy decisions and deliberations within the BJP leadership and also the governmental leadership as well. But with that said, that choice and that decision had certainly been based upon a presumption that if we play nice with the US, they too would play nice with us. So it's not so much we're weak so we have to play nice, but let's play nice so that we can have a quid pro quo. But the trouble with this logic is whilst this would have worked very well and would work very well on Biden or Kamala administration, this sort of logic does not work on Trump. In fact, most logics wouldn't work on Trump, right? Because he's not a man of logic. He's a man of passions. He's a man of tactics. He's a man of ego. He's a man of tremendous strength. He's not a man who responds well to logical reasoning. And thus, in the face of provocative and bellicose gestures from Washington, I reckon Delhi should offer a dual-pronged strategy. On one hand, you seek to court and build back-channel engagements with folks near Trump, which is difficult, given that they often move in and out of his inner circle. But on the other hand, you also have to show that you can choose otherwise. Canada's done that. The UK's done that. Australia's doing that. And I think India, as the chief amongst middle, if not indeed a power that is more powerful than middle powers, as a regional center, as a regional powerhouse, India should and can stand up more resolutely vis-a-vis cajoling and bullying from all other countries, not just the US. Not just the US.
And do you think its partnership or attempts at improving its relationship with China has been one of the ways in which it is establishing that?
For sure, but I want to go back to a part of your earlier question, which is I really hope that both Beijing and Delhi can move past seeing the bilateral relationship through lenses of third parties. And in the eyes of China, of course, they always see the shadow and the spectre of the US behind India, Quad, other security arrangements and partnerships, you name it. And from Delhi's perspective, which is understandable, you would inevitably see China through the lenses of Pakistan, right? CPEC, Gwadar, the links between the military, the supplying of arms involved allegedly in Operation Sindoor. BRI. So there's a lot of skepticism and a lot of fear and mistrust between the personnel on both sides. And I'd be naive to say you can resolve such mistrust through more engagements, more negotiations, all that. This is too Pollyannish. But what I've come to realize is if there's a bit more strategic empathy from both sides, if the Chinese could understand that the Pakistan issue is so important, you know, for the Indians, and if the Indians could recognize that maybe it's not out of malintent, but perhaps just sheer ignorance of what's going on, that the Chinese have done what they've done, then maybe that then could create the seeds, plant the seeds for a more fragile but necessary détente, producing the room for the kinds of dialogues and back-channel conversations we need in order for genuine partnerships down the line. But it will take time. It will take a lot of time. And my fear is that we may not necessarily have the amount of time we need in order for a genuine stabilization of the bilateral relationship before another flare-up, another conflict, and another crisis. But I do want to end on a positive note, which is to say, I was incredibly impressed by the quality of the students I met at JNU, where I was hosted by my dear friend, Professor Aravind Yeleri, and he was very kind in, introducing me to some of the brightest and best China scholars in the university, if not in India, at JNU. And the questions they asked were truly fantastic. Very much like your questions.
One final question, though, before we end this, is going to be, because you talked a lot about the bilateral relations between India and China, one of the ray of hopes that we do kind of see is the way they interact in multilateral institutions, in BRICS, in G20, whether you see the multilateral banks in which both of them have their strong opinions, but they collaborate with each other and cooperate with each other. Do you think that can be one of the ways in which some of that tension could be broken and they can just use that as platform to...
That's exactly right. SS cooperation. South-South cooperation, but real South-South cooperation. So yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This has been fantastic talking to you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad. And I hope you really enjoyed your time in India.
Oh, I did. And I'm looking forward to returning, hopefully soon. Fingers crossed.
Thank you so much.